an act of terror. That's what the president is calling an assault on two National Guardsmen in the nation's capital. So the two soldiers remain in critical condition this morning after police say they were both shot at point-blank range just blocks away from the White House.
We saw one National Guardsman being wheeled out on a stretcher, and he had a device helping pump his heart, it looked like, doing automatic CPR, and his face was covered in blood.
The 29-year-old suspect was tackled at the scene after a brief exchange of gunfire. Law enforcement say he came to the U.S. from Afghanistan about 4 years ago. In response, the president vows to crack down on immigration even further.
All right, so what I'm about to tell you is absolutely insane, and I genuinely cannot believe this isn't the #1 story on every single news network in America right now. Capitol Hill just exploded into complete chaos after lawmakers unveiled shocking new data about civilian deaths linked to President Trump's military operations, and some members of Congress are now openly using the words war crimes. Yeah, you heard that right, war crimes. We're not talking about some foreign dictator or some distant conflict that Americans don't care about. We're talking about sitting members of the United States Congress accusing the current president of potentially violating international humanitarian law based on hard data and casualty reports. This is not some fringe conspiracy theory. This is happening on the floor of the House and Senate right now. This is happening right now. This is real. And the numbers they're citing are absolutely devastating. A Brown University study called the Cost of War Report found that loosening rules of engagement under Trump caused a roughly 330% increase in Afghan civilians killed by U.S. and allied airstrikes between 2016 and 2019. Let me say that again because I need you to really understand what we're talking about here. A 330% increase. That's not a small uptick. That's not a minor statistical blip. That's a massive surge in innocent people dying as a direct result of policy changes made by this administration. We're talking about hundreds of additional deaths that would not have happened under the previous rules. And it gets worse. In 2019 alone, about 700 civilians were killed by airstrikes in Afghanistan. That was the highest number since the start of the entire war, the highest in nearly 2 decades of conflict. Think about that. After 18 years of supposedly learning lessons about minimizing civilian casualties, 2019 was the deadliest year on record for Afghan civilians caught in American airstrikes. And according to the Defense Department's own report to Congress, U.S. military operations in Trump's first year killed approximately 499 civilians and injured around 169 others, with hundreds more cases still under review at the time. These aren't made-up numbers from some partisan think tank. This is the Pentagon's own data being used against them. But here's where things get really explosive. This isn't just about past operations in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. Lawmakers are also pointing to Trump's recent military strikes in the Caribbean, those narco boat operations where alleged drug traffickers were killed in international waters. UN human rights experts and a former International Criminal Court prosecutor have warned that these strikes could amount to extrajudicial executions or even crimes against humanity if civilians were targeted outside of a lawful armed conflict. Come on, Farucha. Are you kidding me? We have international legal experts openly saying the President of the United States might be committing crimes against humanity, and most Americans have no idea this is even happening. The mainstream media is barely covering this. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. Thus, we'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
We're not going to put up with these kind of assaults on law and order by people who shouldn't even be in our country. We must now re-examine every single alien who has entered our country from Afghanistan under Biden, and we must take all necessary measures to ensure the removal of any alien from any country who does not belong here or add benefit to our country. If they can't love our country, we don't want them.
We've got CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein here now. Betsy, we heard the president basically condemning this as an act of terror, but also expanding his concerns to immigration more broadly. I think he brought up Somalia at one point. Can you talk about what the plans are out of the White House?
Right, Audie, just a really horrific day here in Washington, and the Department of Homeland Security has identified Rahman ul.
The reaction on Capitol Hill has been absolutely fierce. Trump allies are accusing Democrats of weaponizing national security and playing politics with military operations. They're saying this is just another attempt to undermine the president and weaken America's ability to fight terrorism and drug cartels. But critics, and there are a lot of them, are saying the numbers speak for themselves. They're saying there's a clear pattern of disregard for civilian life that goes back years and continues to this day. And they want formal congressional inquiries using war crimes frameworks. They want investigations with real subpoena power and real consequences for anyone who violated the law. This is wild. This is genuinely unprecedented territory. We've had presidents criticized for military decisions before. We've had debates about drone strikes and collateral damage and rules of engagement. But I cannot remember a time when sitting members of Congress were openly calling for war crimes investigations against a sitting president based on documented casualty data. The stakes here could not be higher, both for Trump personally and for the broader question of presidential accountability when it comes to military operations. This could fundamentally change how we understand the limits of presidential power in wartime. And the thing that makes this even more explosive is the context. This is happening while Trump is already facing multiple legal challenges on other fronts. The Georgia case just got dismissed. The DOJ is embroiled in controversy over the Epstein files. And now Congress is pushing for investigations into potential violations of international law. It's like every branch of government and every legal system is simultaneously grappling with questions about this president's conduct, and nobody can agree on what accountability should look like or whether it's even possible anymore. Okay, so let's really dig into what's happening here, because this story is way more complicated than the headlines suggest, and most people don't understand the full picture. To get why this matters so much, you need to understand the history, how we got here, and why these particular numbers are causing such an uproar on Capitol Hill right now. This isn't just about one set of strikes or one military operation. This is about a pattern that stretches back years and raises fundamental questions about how America wages war and whether anyone is ever held accountable for civilian deaths. Let's start with the Afghanistan data, because that's where the most damning numbers come from. When Trump took office in 2017, one of the first things his administration did was loosen the rules of engagement for military operations overseas. The idea was to give commanders on the ground more flexibility to strike targets without having to go through as many layers of approval. Trump and his allies argued this would make the military more effective and help defeat ISIS and other terrorist groups faster. They said the Obama administration had been too cautious and had tied the hands of our military with excessive bureaucracy and red tape that was getting American soldiers killed. But here's what actually happened when those rules were loosened. According to the Brown University Costs of War project, which is one of the most comprehensive studies of post-9/11 military operations ever conducted, civilian deaths from airstrikes in Afghanistan skyrocketed after those rules were loosened. We're talking about a 330% increase in Afghan civilians killed by U.S. and allied airstrikes between 2016 and 2019. That's not an exaggeration. That's not spin from a partisan source. That's documented data from researchers who have been tracking these numbers for years across multiple administrations from both parties. The methodology has been peer-reviewed and widely accepted. And 2019 was particularly brutal. About 700 Afghan civilians were killed by airstrikes that year alone, the highest annual total since the war began in 2001. Think about that for a second. After nearly 2 decades of war, after all the lessons supposedly learned about minimizing civilian casualties, 2019 was the worst year on record, and it happened under Trump's watch with his loosened rules of engagement in place. The correlation is impossible to ignore no matter how much his defenders try to spin it away. Now, Trump supporters will argue that you can't blame the president for every military decision made by commanders in the field. They'll say these are complex operations and civilian casualties are sometimes unavoidable in war. And look, there's some truth to that argument. War is messy and tragic, and innocent people sometimes get caught in the crossfire no matter how careful you try to be. That's been true in every conflict throughout human history. But that argument falls apart when you look at the scale of the increase we're talking about. A 330% jump isn't explained by the fog of war or bad luck. That kind of dramatic spike points to systemic policy changes that made civilian deaths more likely and more frequent. And the Pentagon's own numbers back this up completely. The Defense Department reported to Congress that U.S. military operations in Trump's first year killed approximately 499 civilians and injured around 169 others, with hundreds of additional cases still being reviewed at the time of the report. Those are the official numbers from the government itself, and critics argue the real totals are probably much higher because of how the military counts and categorizes casualties. There's been long-standing criticism from human rights groups that the Pentagon undercounts civilian deaths and that the true human cost of these operations has never been fully disclosed to the American public. But here's where this story takes a really dark turn. It's not just about Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria anymore. Lawmakers are now pointing to Trump's recent military operations in the Caribbean as evidence of an ongoing pattern that continues to this day. In 2025, U.S. forces conducted strikes against alleged drug traffickers in international waters. The administration framed these as counter-narcotics operations designed to disrupt cartel supply chains and protect American communities from the drug trade. They sold it as tough action against criminals who are poisoning our communities with fentanyl and other deadly drugs. But UN human rights experts have raised serious concerns about how these operations were conducted and whether they followed international law. They've warned that killing people in international waters outside of a recognized armed conflict could constitute extrajudicial executions under international law. A former prosecutor from the International Criminal Court went even further, suggesting that if civilians were among those targeted, these strikes could potentially amount to crimes against humanity. Those are incredibly serious allegations coming from people who actually understand international humanitarian law and have prosecuted war criminals in the past. And this connects to a broader pattern that legal scholars and human rights advocates have been documenting for years. Under Trump, the U.S. has expanded lethal operations in places like Somalia while simultaneously reducing transparency about who is being killed and under what circumstances. The administration has missed deadlines for reporting civilian casualties to Congress. It has resisted oversight and pushed back against efforts to investigate specific strikes. Critics say this shows a systemic willingness to operate in the shadows, to push or breach the limits of what international law allows, while avoiding accountability and public scrutiny. The thing that makes this so explosive right now is that members of Congress are finally taking these concerns seriously. For years, advocacy groups and legal experts have been warning about civilian casualties and potential law violations. They've been submitting reports and holding press conferences and trying to get anyone in power to listen. But those warnings were largely ignored or dismissed as partisan attacks by people with an agenda. Now, with documented data and expert testimony, lawmakers are actually using words like war crimes on the floor of the House and Senate. They're calling for formal inquiries, they're demanding answers, and they're not backing down. And the political dynamics here are absolutely fascinating to watch. Trump allies are absolutely furious about these accusations. They're accusing Democrats of weaponizing national security for political gain. They're saying this is just another attempt to delegitimize the president and undermine military operations that are keeping Americans safe from terrorists and drug cartels. Representative after representative has gone to the microphones to defend Trump and attack the lawmakers pushing for investigations. The Capitol Hill clashes have been intense, with shouting matches and accusations flying in both directions. But critics aren't backing down even a little bit. They're pointing to the numbers and saying the data speaks for itself. They're bringing in families of civilians killed in these operations to testify about their experiences and humanize the statistics. They're citing international legal experts who say these patterns demand investigation. And they're making the argument that if America doesn't hold its own leaders accountable for potential war crimes, we lose all moral authority to criticize anyone else. How can we lecture other countries about human rights when we won't even investigate our own conduct? Okay, so let's break this down into what really matters because there's a ton of information here, and I want to make sure you understand the key points that you need to take away from this story. This story has huge implications for Trump personally, for how America conducts military operations, and for the broader question of whether presidents can ever be held accountable for what happens in wartime. These are the takeaways you need to remember when discussing this with friends and family. First point, the civilian casualty data is devastating, and it's not going away no matter how much the administration tries to spin it. The 330% increase in Afghan civilian deaths from airstrikes is documented by credible researchers at Brown University using rigorous methodology. The Pentagon's own reports acknowledge hundreds of civilians killed in Trump's first year alone. These aren't partisan talking points or made-up statistics. These are numbers that have been compiled over years using multiple sources and methodologies that have been peer-reviewed. And they paint a picture of military operations that became dramatically more lethal to innocent people after Trump loosened the rules of engagement. His defenders can spin this however they want, but the data exists and it's going to be cited again and again as this debate continues. Second point, the Caribbean strikes represent a potentially explosive new front in this controversy that could have international implications. Whatever you think about counter-narcotics operations and fighting drug cartels, conducting lethal strikes in international waters raises serious questions under international law that can't be ignored. When UN human rights experts and former ICC prosecutors start using phrases like extrajudicial executions and crimes against humanity, that's not hyperbole or political rhetoric. Those are specific legal terms with specific meanings under international law, and if investigations reveal that civilians were among those killed, or that proper legal frameworks weren't followed, the consequences could be severe. This isn't just domestic political theater. International bodies could potentially get involved and pursue their own investigations. Third point, the transparency problem makes everything worse and prevents any kind of meaningful accountability. One of the most consistent criticisms of Trump's military operations is that his administration has actively resisted disclosing information about who is being killed and under what circumstances. Deadlines for reporting civilian casualties to Congress have been missed repeatedly. Requests for information have been delayed or denied without explanation, and the pattern of secrecy makes it impossible for the public or lawmakers to fully understand what's happening in these operations being conducted in their name. When you combine aggressive military action with reduced transparency, you create conditions where abuses can occur without accountability. That's exactly what critics are warning about. Fourth point, this reframes Trump's entire tough on terror and tough on drugs image as potential legal liability. Trump has always marketed himself as the president who's willing to do whatever it takes to protect America, even if that means making hard choices and ignoring criticism from human rights groups and international bodies. His supporters love that image. They see it as strength and decisiveness in a dangerous world. But what lawmakers are now arguing is that toughness crossed a line into potential war crimes. That's a completely different framing, and if it gains traction, it could fundamentally change how people view Trump's national security legacy. Instead of the president who crushed ISIS and took on the cartels, he could become the president who killed hundreds of innocent civilians and violated international law. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this fight is just getting started and there's a lot of uncertainty ahead. The lawmakers pushing for war crimes investigations face significant obstacles. Republicans control key committees, and they're not going to allow hearings that could damage Trump or his legacy. The administration will fight any effort to release additional information about military operations using every legal tool available, and there's genuine legal uncertainty about whether a sitting president can even be held accountable for decisions made as commander-in-chief. The constitutional questions here are complicated and there's no clear precedent to follow. But the pressure isn't going away no matter what obstacles are put up. Human rights groups are mobilizing like never before. International bodies are paying attention and monitoring the situation closely. And the data that's already public provides ammunition for ongoing criticism, even if formal investigations never materialize. Every time there's a new military strike, every time civilians are reported killed, critics will point back to this pattern and demand answers. The political cost of these operations may be higher than Trump anticipated when he loosened those rules of engagement. And here's the thing that really matters for the average American watching this. These debates about rules of engagement and civilian casualties and international law might seem abstract and distant. They're happening in faraway places to people most Americans will never meet or think about. But the decisions being made in your name, by your government, have real consequences for real people. When 700 Afghan civilians die in airstrikes in a single year, those are human beings with families and hopes and futures that were cut short. When alleged drug traffickers are killed in international waters without trial, questions about due process and the rule of law should matter to everyone who believes in American values. The broader context here is also crucial to understanding why this matters right now. This is happening as Trump faces challenges on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Georgia case dismissal, the Epstein files controversy, now potential war crimes allegations from members of his own government. It's creating a sense that accountability is either impossible or inevitable depending on who you ask. His supporters see a president being unfairly targeted by enemies on all sides. His critics see a president who has escaped consequences for too long and is finally being confronted with the full scope of his actions. What we're witnessing is a fundamental clash over what presidential accountability should look like in the modern era. Can a president be held responsible for military decisions that result in civilian deaths? Should international law apply to American leaders the same way it applies to everyone else? Is Congress capable of providing meaningful oversight when the parties are so polarized? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're being forced into the spotlight by the data and testimony now emerging on Capitol Hill. So that's where we stand right now. Lawmakers are citing devastating civilian casualty data and openly discussing war crimes investigations. Trump allies are fighting back furiously and accusing Democrats of politicizing national security. International legal experts are warning that recent operations may have crossed serious lines. And the American public is being asked to grapple with difficult questions about what's being done in their name overseas. This story is going to develop rapidly over the coming weeks. There will be hearings. There will be testimony. There will be political warfare on a scale we haven't seen before around these issues. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of it. Drop a comment telling me what you think. Should there be war crimes investigations? Is this legitimate oversight or political theater? I want to hear from you, and I'll see you in the next one.